Awesome. Thanks, Gina.
Okay, we are indeed live. All right, and it is 4:30. So I guess, should we go ahead and hop in, or do you want to give people a couple seconds to show up?
I'm giving people a couple of minutes to kind of gather. I can't see how many there are right now, though, so maybe I'm wrong.
Let's see, it looks like we have at least 2 viewers currently.
Excellent. Hi, Bran. Or Brandon, sorry, I don't know why I nicknamed you.
It's cool. Bran is, yeah, I think also acceptable. Okay, so yes, I guess we'll just, I kind of feel like we should small talk while we wait for people, but we were secretly small talking before we went live, so all of our viewers missed out on that exciting conversation about bikes.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah, I was meaning to tell you, is it cool if we just only talk about bikes for this conversation? I know we had some questions prepared, but
I'm sure that the philosophy of bikes could be interesting. I wouldn't have much to say about it, but
I.
okay, so it is a minute after 4. Oh, and okay, Carl Aho says, good afternoon. It's great to be with you. And Kit says hi and excited to hear your interview.
Yay, hi everybody.
Okay, so with that, I think we will go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our 3rd public philosophy talk. In this talk series, Loyola University Chicago MAP members interview philosophers in different stages of their career about the intersection between academic philosophy and public life. So this talk series is sponsored by LUC's MAP chapter. MAP, or Minorities in Philosophy, is an international program that seeks to address structural injustices in academic philosophy and to remove barriers in the field for members of traditionally marginalized groups. I'm Gina Lebkuecher. I'm a PhD candidate here at Loyola University Chicago and a MAP graduate member. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Rebecca, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rebecca Valeriano Flores. I'm also a graduate student at Loyola. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm going to be doing the tech stuff in the background and moderating the chat.
Great, thanks. And then for today's talk, I will be interviewing Claire Lockard on academic labor, organizing, and useful anger. So Claire, would you like to please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to this talk/conversation. I use she, her pronouns, and I guess starting this week, have officially finished my 5th year in the doctoral program at Loyola Chicago, and I'm really excited to be with y'all today.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm excited to have you here as well, and thank you to everyone else for joining us as well. As always, please feel free to submit questions or comments in the YouTube chat, and we'll do our best to address those as they come along. And to get us started, Seth and Helen say hi, Claire.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. But before we get into the questions, I believe some congratulations are in order, Claire. So first of all, congratulations on earning the American Association of University Women's Fellowship. I understand that this is a pretty competitive fellowship, and it's $20,000, an international fellowship, which funds a year of research. So you must be very excited, and again, congrats on that, and I'm sure it's very well earned.
Thank you.
Secondly, I wanted to congratulate you and thank you for all your work towards a major union win that we've had here at Loyola. So for those of you who may not know, our school, Loyola University Chicago, just a few weeks ago, I think now, committed to providing graduate workers with a big pay increase. So Claire, as a leading member of the LUC Graduate Workers Union, could you talk about how we got here and some of the struggles you faced, as well as the victories we've had along the way?
Yeah. And before I start talking for real, I want to tell anybody who's listening that when I'm excited or a little nervous, both of which are true right now, I tend to talk really fast. So if you miss something, go ahead and throw it in the chat, or you need me to repeat myself or slow way down, let me know. Okay. So I think I'm going to start answering your question by telling a story of how the union came to be. And it feels like a very long story because so in, I believe, 2017 or the end of 2016, the National Labor Relations Board ruled that graduate students at private universities were employees and were eligible to form graduate worker unions. So if folks are familiar with like big public schools, those places have had grad unions for a really long time. But whether or not private school grad students count as employees is sort of up to the NLRB to decide as they decide or as they see fit. And that tends to vacillate with whoever the party of the president is. But Loyola was one of the first private grad student bodies to unionize. So we voted in our union. We have a legally certified union that formed in like February, I think, of 2017. If folks know the actual date, you can throw it in the chat because I might be messing that up. But Loyola to this day has refused to recognize the graduate worker union. So they won't bargain with us. They insist that we are students in training and not employees. They give us W-2s. They tax us on the healthcare they provide. But they refuse to acknowledge that we are doing important labor for the university. So that's illegal. I just want to like flag that and know that like every moment that Loyola doesn't bargain with us, they are violating labor laws. And so that's kind of the background against which the Loyola Graduate Workers Union has been operating. And so we have throughout over the years tried so many different tactics to get Loyola to the bargaining table. We've staged grade-ins in the student center. I was like, what are the words that I'm looking for? We have marched on campus. We have stood on the picket lines in solidarity with the non-tenure track and adjunct faculty. We had a group of students get arrested at the downtown campus, demanding to be met at the bargaining table. We did a one-day walkout where we withheld our labor from the university. So we've tried all these different tactics. We've also, all along the way, been meeting with members of Loyola's administration, especially those within the graduate school, to sort of push them to recognize the union, but also just give us things that help us lead more livable lives, even if they're not going to bargain with us. So it's this sort of multiplicity of tactics that we're trying in order to like get something done. So one of those things is particularly during the past year when COVID has made everyone's lives so much more precarious and difficult, including graduate workers. And we've been meeting with Dean Barman of the graduate school. So a contingent of about 4 or 5 members of the graduate worker union meet with her once a month. And usually those meetings go, hey, we really need these things to make our lives livable and possible, and to like do any of the work that you're sort of demanding of us. And she says, no, we can't do that. So that's sort of like how these have gone. But we've been arguing, like, one of our biggest asks for as long as I've been in graduate school here has been that we need a living wage, or we need something closer to a living wage. So for folks who don't know already, graduate workers at Loyola were making a stipend of $18,000 a year. So we were expected to just like make ends meet with that amount of money. And I think the living wage in Chicago, they recommend for someone who's single without kids, like $28,000 at least. I think it might be a little bit higher, and that wouldn't be surprising for folks who live here. So finally, 2 weeks ago at our meeting with Dean Barman, we found out that we would be getting this raise. And so really, I think without the advocacy of the graduate worker union, not that there weren't other groups that are pushing for this change, but we saw it as a really big win for us. And I think it's important to remember that this was not an act of benevolence or generosity on Loyola's part. It was them sort of finally recognizing that what they were paying us was like monstrous. So anyway, that's the long story of how that pay raise sort of came to be.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've been, working really hard and having these weekly meetings for a really long time. So it is nice, of course, to see something come of it. And now that this has happened, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the future of the union's work, not just at Loyola, but also what you see as the future of other unions' work and other graduate departments around the country.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'll start with Loyola and then maybe work my way out. So pay was like one of the big things that Loyola is trying to advocate for, but we also have one other things in our 5 years that we're looking to sort of even further improve upon. So Loyola graduate workers get dental coverage, for example. And I think this is a fairly unusual benefit for graduate workers. I can't really speak to other kinds of workers. But over and over again, we found it's really difficult to access that dental coverage, or that it covers like maybe a bare minimum teeth cleaning, but if you need literally anything else, it's really not very useful. So improving some of the things that we already have, and also making sure that this pay raise is applied to all graduate workers and not just like currently funded PhD students of certain kinds. So we're sort of still in conversation with the graduate school around what it looked like, who is being left out of the conversation, and so who we can like be better advocates for. I'm trying to think what else we sort of talked about recently. The sort of thing that's always our goal is to get to the bargaining table, because right now Loyola, without a contract, without a union contract signed and sort of ratified, can take away any pay raise, any benefits, any improvement that they make, just because, and they don't need to sort of justify it, and we have no recourse. So getting all of these improvements also like formalized in a contract is going to be really important. And we're hoping that with the Biden administration being a little bit more pro-labor, obviously, than the most recent one, that we can kind of make some progress there. And I've been seeing a lot of like encouraging signs from other graduate workers at private institutions who are saying, oh, look, like even without being formally recognized, like we see an administration in Loyola sort of recognizing the needs of their graduate workers and being able to meet those. There's also other Jesuit universities who have voluntarily recognized graduate unions, so without it being such a fight to the bargaining table. So I am hopeful that this is a sign of like, okay, these kinds of victories are possible for graduate unions, even though like the odds are very stacked against us, and that we can sort of build on this momentum and grow our union. We have like a large union membership, but grow the number of people who are really active in the union once we can sort of be back on campus and kind of all together again.
Great, thanks. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask. Okay, so what do you see as the connection between your work as a philosopher and your union work?
So we talked about this a little bit in the past. I feel like it's a little bit, there's a tension between some of the ways that my philosophy training does and doesn't help me. Because on the one hand, you can sort of use all the tools of philosophy and analyze, well, okay, this is a injustice, this is exploitation, this is unethical, this is like a social political problem that requires our careful analysis and understanding and placing it in a historical context. So all of these sort of philosophical like research or thinking or argumentative skills seem to come in really handy for understanding problems of worker exploitation and labor justice. And I will say that Loyola's philosophy department has by and large been super supportive of graduate worker and adjunct and non-tenure track unionization efforts. And so walking the picket lines, canceling classes in solidarity, sort of reaching out and saying, hey, how can I be like in solidarity with you? And so in that way, it feels like sort of the skills I've learned as a philosopher and the things I know as a philosopher have been really helpful. But then on the other hand, Loyola is not refusing to bargain with us because they've not been given a good, like valid, sound, rational, full of facts argument made by like a really solid philosophical scholar, right? Like it's not an epistemological problem. It's not that they don't know that we weren't being paid enough or that we are exploited workers on this campus or that we play an essential role in letting Loyola be the institution that it is. There's something else like missing there. So in that way, I've had to like be finding and using other sorts of philosophical resources and sort of thinking outside of my own discipline in order to make those like organizing union activity moves. So it's one way in which I feel like philosophy as dominantly construed or practiced kind of lets us down. Like we know that the problem is not that they've not been given a good argument for why they should recognize the union or should never have put graduate workers in this exploited position in the first place. But there's also a lot of philosophical resources to kind of explain what's going on there. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I understand if you're mostly wanting to talk about, of course, your own experience, the connection to graduate labor specifically and at Loyola. But I'm also wondering if you see these kinds of struggles as connected to a kind of broader problem within academia or the way that like academic labor is expected to be practiced or the kinds of burdens that are placed on people. I know that's something that you're also interested in, so I guess I'd just invite you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I feel like I see this or people talking about this a lot on philosophy Twitter as well, which is exciting is maybe the wrong word because it's really demoralizing as well. But I think especially given the hit that the academic job market has taken in, I don't even want to say in the wake of COVID because we're very much not in its wake, but as a result of an ongoing pandemic and it's like stacked upon an already horrific job market, this myth of meritocracy is slowly being, or maybe all at once, dissolving. So for any folks who are listening and who are not academic philosophers, there's, I think, this idea that if you present at enough conferences as a graduate student, if you publish enough papers, if you network with the right people, I just want to aggressively like scare quote all of these words I'm saying, that there's some formula you can sort of do in order to get an academic job, and that if you just do all those things, you'll be one of the lucky ones. And I know that even as I sort of said, oh no one gets jobs, or jobs are really hard to get, or it's not just that you have to be the best at this thing, I found myself kind of in the back of my head being like, yeah, but I might be one of the lucky ones. Like maybe I can do it. And so I think like one thing that I guess COVID has really laid bare, although it's always been true, is that you can't just like suffer and be in poverty as a graduate worker and overwork yourself and have no life and be willing to move anywhere in the country for a one-year job, and have that sort of eventually turn into a stable, steady academic career, or that is much less common than I think we often imagine it to be. And so I feel like I'm focusing a little bit more on like, where is it going to get you? But I also want to sort of pay attention to the ways that grads students all over are in these departments working our asses off, making these huge improvements to departments, contributing so much for a discipline that really doesn't love us back in the end. Is sometimes how it feels, but maybe that's just the mood I'm in today. I don't know.
Yeah. And I know, of course, that a lot of, non-tenure track workers and people who are tenure track but pre-tenure also face very similar
Absolutely.
pressures. Yeah. So I guess if you were in charge, what kind of things would you recommend to help academia improve on this? And also, do you have any advice for what maybe some of our listeners who are undergrads, grads, or faculty can do to also make some positive change in this area?
Yeah, so it's hard because I sometimes find myself, and I think this is important to a degree, pointing out structural problems when asked to speak about individual or smaller level changes. And on the one hand, I think that's really important to recognize, like it's not any one philosophy department's fault that, they're not offering a living wage to the students that they admit to their program. That we're in this huge network of like universities being encouraged and pressured politically and because of this capitalistic way that the university is run and funded, to devote resources to certain places and not to others. And so I want to kind of recognize that there's this like larger sort of like educational revolution that would need to happen for us to really flourish as academics. But that's true of really almost anything I can think of. Like we would need pretty fundamental foundational social changes for everybody to be kind of live in their best lives. So that was the one hand. I think I promised another hand. On the other hand, I would say that I've seen some really cool and promising changes in academic philosophy, even since I was starting. Like, I think even MAP was either just getting started or wasn't really like as widely on the radar as it has become in the last maybe time that I've been in graduate school. So I've only been a philosopher of any sort for, I guess, since undergrad and grad, so we can call it 8 years. But I do feel like I've seen some promising movement in terms of opening up philosophy as a discipline to more kinds of questions, more kinds of thinkers, more interdisciplinarity. Always push back to that, but I see little moments, little opportunities. And then you also asked me about advice or just kind of like speaking to folks who might be listening who are thinking about graduate education. Sorry, I'm getting feedback on the noise. I guess one thing that's sort of a practical and maybe union related matter is that if you're really interested in going to graduate school in any field, being able to do so without going into debt or further student debt is really, I think, important, or for many folks. So especially if you're thinking about going in the next like year or so, really keeping track of which programs have started to admit students again. Loyola, for example, did not admit any PhD students for the 2021 through 22 academic year as part of a round of COVID-related budget cuts.
Looks like we have a question from the chat. So Brandon asks, what jobs other than a philosophy professor might you pursue, assuming that the situation in academia doesn't get better?
That is a question that I ask myself. I feel like every other day I'll say, what am I going to be when I grow up? Because I don't have a lot of optimism for me, not because I don't think I would be a good professional philosopher, but again, because there just aren't opportunities to do that. I've really been enjoying being an academic editor. So Gina actually very kindly connected me with some folks who already do that work. So I really like helping other people develop research or their own writing and make it clearer or like more like better organized. And so that's been fun. Or even indexed a book recently and I was like, oh my God, it's so great. I get to like take all of the things that are mentioned and then put them in this new order and find them all. And so there's something about taking something that looks like a mess and putting it together in a different way that I find really fun. And so I might do that, but I don't know. So if anyone has ideas, throw them in the chat. I will consider them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something to think about. And I will say our department, it has been really nice the way they've set up, and I'm sure this is the case in a lot of departments around the country, some kind of mentorship and guidelines to help PhDs think about jobs outside of academia. So yeah, it is something that's on the forefront of everybody's mind. But of course, there is still a lot to love, at least for me, about academia. So I do want to hear from you, Claire. It's great to hear that you're enjoying the academic editing. What other aspects about being a PhD spark joy for you, if any? And it's okay. I'm not trying to like sugarcoat things.
Yeah, on the one hand, I almost feel like I have to think far back in the past to the before times of like, when did this spark joy? But there is something really fun, and this maybe ties to one of the themes of our conversation today about what I started to call rage research. And so I know you said spark joy and I turned to rage, but
that's fine.
It's all right. I think Ao Awara, faculty member in our department, also said the phrase rage research. So I'm not actually sure like where that phrase comes from, but I really like it. And what I mean by that is philosophy has given me the tools to say, oh, that really pisses me off. Why is it that I think that this thing is like giving me this gut reaction of, well, like, is there language I can put to it? If not, how else can I like think about what's going on? And that really like energizes me, or helps me be able to get this clarity of learning more and exploring something further.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's really insightful. That is one of the things I love about philosophy too. It's just that, things are always going to bother you, but philosophy kind of gives you the tools to help figure out why and to help put words to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that reminds me of the topic of your dissertation. So I'm no spoilers, so I'm just going to ask you, could you quickly give us like a kind of, elevator pitch, or just the kind of basic topic that you're working on for your dissertation, and maybe tell us a little bit about the experiences you've had that led you to take an interest in that topic?
Yeah, I will answer that with another potentially convoluted story. But when I started graduate school, so I'd been pretty trained in the contemporary feminist philosophy, particularly, and I didn't come from an undergraduate institution that really placed a lot of emphasis on the canon or on history of philosophy. And so graduate school was one of the first times that I was reading a lot of these texts, or the first time I was reading them in this new sort of more rigorous or more like close reading kind of way. And I would ask in different classes, like, hey, what do we do with this thinker's sexism? Or like, ooh, this is a pretty gross passage. And I found myself being told, oh, you need to read charitably. So my dissertation is about the call for interpretive charity in philosophy. So this idea that we should give texts or authors the benefit of the doubt and assume that there's something important there that is intelligible and sort of holds together or like makes sense is important to engage with, and that we need to do that charitable work before we get mad at it or critique it. And so like paying attention to that, again, that rage or that anger that I felt about like, well, that doesn't feel like, I don't want to give this text a charitable reading. Why am I being asked this? What's going on here? Something about that call for charity in that context felt wrong or incorrect, or like the charitability had either been misapplied or is something that we maybe should abandon altogether and try for different ways of engaging with text and see how generative that can be. So my dissertation is sort of exploring what I call the charitability gap. So this gap between who we are asked to read charitably. So which thinkers are we sort of saying, oh no, we got to like bracket this part in order to sort of get the whole picture, and who are we sort of leaving aside? And also a charitability gap between who we do and don't ask charity from. Because I sort of suspect that folks who are already marginalized in the discipline of philosophy, so people who aren't men, people who aren't white, people with disabilities, queer and trans people, are asked disproportionately often to offer that charitable interpretation. And so I'm looking at some of the epistemic and the interpretive harms that emerge when we rely on charitable readings. And all of that started with rage.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the first time I've heard about your project, but I appreciate, I always appreciate hearing about it because I think it's very valuable. Yeah, and we have a question from the chat, which you may have already answered, but it was from Carl. What are you currently rage researching? So is there anything outside of what you just talked about, the charitability gap, that your rage has fueled your research on?
I'll be honest, not really lately, because I spent a ton of time this year applying for fellowships. So this kind of ties back in. So it's really awesome that I have this fellowship from the American of university women, I applied for a ton of other external fellowships. So instead of having like time to rage research something else that was sort of giving me that feeling, I was filling out applications about why I deserved a not quite living wage for another year. So I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer to that, because I wish, if anyone again has suggestions for things that make you mad that you've would like some rage research done about, let me know.
Yeah, well, at least your rage has fueled your work in other productive ways, such as, of course, coming here to talk to us about it, and then, of course, all your union advocacy lately. Yeah. So I'd just like to ask, on behalf of, say, people who do really like history of philosophy,
yeah.
If there's someone who really likes, for example, Kant or Aristotle, what would you say to them about this kind of charitability gap and the kinds of problems of interpretation that you've noticed and that you're researching?
Yeah, and you are welcome to chime in here as well, because you are writing a dissertation in part on Aristotle, and so you know more of him than me specifically. But I think I would, first of all, say, like, it is cool to love like your guy or like your figure in the history of philosophy. If we sort of all abandoned the problematic faves or the problematic figures in our discipline, we would be left with nothing. And I don't just mean that it's because the history of philosophy is full of racists, although it is. I also just mean that no text, no matter how sort of careful it's being to sort of be inclusive or work against dominant discursive norms or challenge the status quo of whatever it's writing about, no text is going to do that perfectly. And so I think a lot about Alexis Shotwell's work on purity, and everyone in the chat who knows me is going to laugh at me saying that, because that's my has everyone read Against Purity? But she sort of worries about this idea that, I can just sort of rid myself or my own personal like social world of problematic things or things that are bad or impure, and sort of be left with, that's how I become a good person. And so I guess the first thing I would say is like, I'm not saying like put down Aristotle or don't read Kant anymore. I often am heard as saying that. So I used to give these papers on charity and the charitability gap at conferences. If folks remember conferences where people could walk up to you afterwards and ask you questions. And I would always get someone who said, is it okay if I still assign so-and-so? Or like, I still do X in my class. Like, what do you think about that? So this real concern that I've sort of suggested that they have to abandon everything about the canon in service of fixing this charitability problem. That is not what I think, although I would suggest moving a little bit away from the canon and teaching just for service of good pedagogy. That's maybe a different question. But I would say that there are ways to both like approach a text yourself and teach a text. And that's sort of what I'm most interested in, teaching those texts that is generative, but does not rely on a charitable sort of starting point at any time. I also, especially for the teaching question, have gotten a lot of feedback that like students don't find this call for charity to be particularly clear. So it's not really like helping them understand what they're actually supposed to do. Like, she told me to do charity. I don't know what that means. Why? Am I supposed to donate something? And that it sort of forecloses all these insights that emerge from those like feelings of, yuck, like what do we do with this? So there's a lot of important conversation and important kinds of scholarly research that you're closing down by sort of falling back on this this attitude of charitability. But again, that doesn't mean that like you have to leave it all behind.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, and yeah, I appreciate you making clear, because I've run into things like that too, where you're being critical of a very well-regarded philosopher, and a lot of people, I think their kind of first reaction is to be a little bit defensive, right? And so, but if I'm hearing you correctly, you're not saying that like we need to be throwing out these people. We just need to be acknowledging that we can talk about, say, Aristotle's views on women, and also talk about positive aspects of Aristotle's philosophy. Yeah?
Yeah, and I guess I also, maybe this is only a little bit related to what you're saying, but I'm interested in this anxiety that seems to come up around the challenge or the questioning of charitability. So it seems like charitability is this really like unexamined, but perhaps fundamental, like methodological norm that we have in philosophy, but that we don't always put a name to until we perceive as absence or something like that. Like, oh no, something's missing. This isn't going the way that I want. We're being too critical of this thing. Now it's time for like charity to come in and sort of get us back on this like proper path, this proper way of doing philosophy. Like if you're not being sufficiently charitable, then you haven't done philosophy right somehow. I don't think that answered or responded to your question, but it was sort of whatever you said made me think of that.
No, yeah, that is very helpful. And we have some more stuff from the chat. Okay, yeah. So a comment and a question from Carl. Carl, first of all, I think just wants to acknowledge that the dissertation stage and the accompanying raging about lack of funding is pretty all-consuming.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for your recognition.
And then he asks, looking at the rage part of your rage research, is your approach broadly Aristotelian? That is there a right time, place, extent, and reason to rage research?
That is a good question. I've never thought of it as Aristotelian in that way, but now that you sort of put it here, or I'm looking at the text in our little Zoom chat too, that's an interesting way to think about it. I think so. I tend to not have, when I think about my work on charitability, I sort of go back and forth about whether I have sort of some kind of Aristotelian, like right context, right amount, et cetera, sense of like, okay, do I want to save some notion of interpretive charity and just have us like use it better or apply it better? Or is it the case that sort of all uses of charity are risking these problems and that we need to really sort of leave it behind in favor of some other like way of relating to texts? So it really depends on the day, because I haven't written chapter 5 yet. So I have a little bit of like a leeway here. Most of my work is just sort of thinking, well, what would happen if we sort of bracketed charitability? Like we just sort of set it aside for a minute, like what emerges there? So I'm sort of just thinking in real time about whether I would feel the same way about rage research. I think sometimes, and this is, I'll speak for myself, if I'm mad about something and want to learn more about it, I'll then be looking for things that might like justify my anger. And so there's this sort of maybe self-reflective or maybe more importantly, this communal aspect of like, hey, this thing happened, or like this, I'm learning about this thing. Here's what I'm imagining. Do you have the same read on this? Sort of being in community with folks who can say, you know, yeah, that seems like a really like juicy problem. Like you should look into that more, versus like, no, like that's not the way. I think that's how we kind of get ourselves trapped in like sort of bubbles, and then we can't figure out ways either out of that rage or like towards something different. But I appreciate that question. Thanks, Carl.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. And of course, Claire, you know a lot more about this than I do. So it's not something I've thought very carefully about. But I do wonder, so it sounds like a lot of your work is on the calls for charity in academic philosophy, but I'm wondering what kind of outside of academic philosophy, how do you see the same phenomenon, or do you see the same phenomenon happening in different places? And do you see evidence of the intuition you mentioned earlier about the way that there's this gap in terms of maybe marginalized people being asked to be charitable more, and people being asked to be charitable towards people who are less marginalized?
Yeah, I feel like there's some work on in epistemic injustice literature about the credibility gap. So this gap between who and how we believe when they say things. I'm thinking of, I think Audrey Yap might be a person whose essay that I'm thinking of right now. I believe that's the title of it, but it's been a while since I've read it. But yeah, I think like, although my dissertation is about the charitability gap in academic philosophy specifically, which you would think would be too narrow to write a whole dissertation about, but turns out it is not. My dissertation director was really like, you really just like expand, talk about the other stuff later. That can be your like whole career. You can explore other kinds of charitability problems. But like, I feel like when I read the news or think about sort of who we even give the floor to, like who do we even allow to speak such that we could receive their testimony with charity or not charity. So just in terms of airtime is one way that I'll sort of notice it. So I feel like the charitability gap sort of extends to different places, but it's not solely about who we're listening to, it's how we're hearing them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes, that does make sense, I will say. Yeah, it's a lot to think about, and I'm sure that you know, as that a lot of our listeners and I can certainly think of my own examples and my own experience of facing this kind of gap, not just about who we're asked to be charitable towards, but also who we're kind of expected to take as an authority. So that is really interesting. I guess just to pivot a little bit, I know you've also done some research on trying to get women more involved in philosophy. Is that right? You did part of that as an undergraduate project. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you would maybe talk a little bit about your experience with that research and if you gleaned anything of use that we might, I don't know, put into practice ourselves.
Hypothetically, yeah. One, I'm like, where do I even start? So I was part of a research team that worked for several years on this question of why are women so underrepresented in philosophy? So there's lots of different groups we could talk about being underrepresented in philosophy. This was about 5 years ago, and there's a lot of literature specifically about people who identify as women who are underrepresented in philosophy. I think women make up 17% of tenured philosophy faculty now. And I don't think that number has gone up since I last like looked it up. I'm like, maybe it's more now. It's never more. But so we did a bunch of like deep diving into the data of like, okay, who are the people at this institution? What are the demographic breakdowns of our classes? Which ones have more? How many majors? We also did a survey of undergraduate students to kind of figure out their perceptions of philosophy. And we did focus groups with young women who had taken philosophy, who had never taken philosophy, and who just taken one class. So we were sort of trying to like ask them, what was it about philosophy that like felt good for you, or that you like didn't want to take it again, or why'd you take it in the first place, or why did it never occur to you to take philosophy? And one thing that we found that students reported who had taken a bunch of classes was like, oh, there was this one professor who encouraged me to take more classes. So there's, of course, like I was mentioning earlier, a bunch of structural reasons why philosophy is an exclusionary discipline or isn't welcoming to people who are from sort of marginalized social groups. And so there's lots of sort of big level changes that would need to happen for the demographics to really make a shift. But one like small thing that people who are teaching can do, and a lot of folks I know who are teachers do this really well, is like encourage students specifically reaching out in a very like one-on-one, like, hey, you were good at X. You should keep taking classes. So just being really like frank and clear about what was working. Other things were very surprising that we ended up changing to see if they would work. Like, oh, we tend to have more women in this intro level class versus that intro level class. So let's just offer more sections of that. So that stuff that you maybe wouldn't necessarily link to the gender gap in philosophy, or it's like, well, we're not really interested in like why that's the case, but if that's the case, then let's just sort of run with it. So it's interesting to kind of learn about these like roundabout interventions to make.
Yeah, that is all really interesting. And I especially appreciate the insight about the value of professors reaching out specifically to students and encouraging them explicitly. Because yeah, I've had experiences like that have made a difference, and I'm sure a lot of people in the chat can relate as well.
My mic is scratching a little bit, so we're going to see. Let me know if this works better. If anyone in the chat is having problems hearing, just throw something in there.
I can hear you. Great. So, but yeah. Well, obviously, we've talked about a lot of heavy topics, but you know, despite all of the kind of depressing things about academia and also about the pandemic that we're in, I'm just wondering, how do you, we've talked about how your rage is fueling you, which is very helpful. And I'm going to try, and next time I'm angry, I'm going to try and channel it into my writing and research. But I'm wondering, other than that, are there any, like, I don't know, tips and tricks, hobbies that you've used to kind of keep things fresh and to kind of keep yourself going with philosophy?
Ooh, with philosophy. I was ready to tell you about my newfound like quarantine hobbies.
I mean, if it's teaching you, yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I found really helpful, especially in the last year, unsurprisingly, has been reading groups and working groups. And so, and I might continue doing, I mean, I was always doing reading groups, but kind of picking, so I've been reading a bunch of epic poems translated by people who aren't white men with some of my friends. So we read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. We're working on Shadi Barch's translation of the Aeneid right now. And so working on stuff that's pretty outside my wheelhouse philosophically, but is sort of related to questions about, well, how do we read these classics? What are ways of engaging with those texts that are, that bring us joy and energy rather than just like, oh my God, I have to skim over the like violent, gross part now. Not that those aren't there, but they're sort of rendered quite differently depending on who translates and what their sort of social and political commitments are. So I've been doing book club and Gina, you'll know this, but doing a lot of co-working sessions where we'll be on Zoom, but muted for a couple of hours, which if you are not doing that might sound very unpleasant or like, why would you ever? But then sort of tuning back in and checking in, okay, like how much, what, not even how much did you get done, but what sort of were you spending time on with those 2 hours? And how's your research going? And would you have questions? So building that intellectual community or holding on to it in a new way has been really helpful. And one of the things I do like about being in academic philosophy is sort of getting to take on this whole big project of, oh, I have this question or this set of questions, and I get to just decide how to answer them and then work out better and better answers, even though I'm not like ever going to reach some kind of final point. I do love that about philosophy.
Yeah, I agree. And another thing that I love about philosophy that I'm sure you can relate to is that kind of community where you're able to work with people, you're able to like put things out there, hear other people's thoughts on it. So it's great. Yeah, it's great to hear that book clubs and co-working have been really effective for you during the pandemic. I'm hoping, of course, that when we get back in person, we can further like kind of lean on our colleagues. So I am actually a little bit interested in, so you said you were going to tell us about your new quarantine hobby of crosswords?
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. So how do you find that? I don't know, I imagine it would help broaden your vocabulary and draw connections and things like that. Is there any way that like you see it relating to your writing, or is it mostly just something to kind of give you something to look forward to? So
it is the way that I have started to turn my brain on in the morning. So I'll stumble to the coffee maker, push the button, and that's, you know, that's big, impressive for the morning. And then do the puzzle, and no one's allowed to talk to me while I'm puzzling because I have to like try to beat my time. But there's a very specific like grammar to the crossword puzzle. So once you kind of learn like, oh, this kind of clue means that you need to fill it with this kind of word. Oh, this is going to be a pun, or, oh, there's a theme, I have to figure it out. I've not drawn like specific connections to my philosophy or it being helpful, but I will say it was nice to notice myself getting better at a thing. So I've been doing them for about a year. And I'm so much, not even just like, oh, I'm beating my personal record, but I'll make the connection so much faster. And it's really hard sometimes, especially when you're in graduate school, to kind of see yourself getting better at things. And so having an example of here's a skill that I have built, maybe I can build other skills like write this chapter that is just sitting on my computer.
Yeah, that is really helpful, and I can see how that would be valuable. I mean, I know you've attended some of these public philosophy talks before, and a question that always comes up is how do you like deal with grad school? You know what I mean? Like, what are the kind of coping strategies or like ways to do work-life balance and stuff like that? So it is, I can definitely see how like having a skill that you're building that's not directly related to your philosophical research can be very helpful for that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any other, I agree with you on the co-working, right? Those kinds of Zoom study sessions have been helpful for me. I don't know if you have any other quick tips.
I don't know. I think one thing that I am bad at and trying to get better at is not sort of thinking about everything in my life as a means to a philosophic end. So being more intentional about getting rest and just like leaving everything aside, or not feeling bad about it, or not saying, okay, what did I get done today? Was that a sufficient amount of progress? Progress sort of like what, it's not even really clear what that means, especially given the year that we've had. It's like, well, I'm still kicking. Like, I feel like that ought to have been enough all of this time, you know?
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we could definitely keep talking for a while about this kind of pull between trying to be productive, but also trying to be gentle with ourselves and generous to ourselves, and the kinds of pressures to stay productive despite it all. But I've got a couple comments and questions from the chat, so let me just read those. So Kit says, fun fact, it sounds like, if you turn a blank crossword puzzle upside down, the pattern of black and white squares stays the same.
What?
Incredible. I'll have to check that next time I see one.
That makes me want to get one in hard copy and like have the clues on one side, but then turn it upside down just to, like, I believe you, Kit. I would not like, but I want to try.
And okay, we only have about 10 minutes left, but I think we do have time for this question, hopefully. So Brandon asks, Claire, could you talk about a little bit about teaching during the pandemic? Have students been engaged? What has worked and what hasn't?
Ooh. So I actually have been on a fellowship this year that has not required me to teach during the pandemic. So I don't have any firsthand sort of reports about what the students' engagement or what's worked and hasn't, but I wonder if Gina might speak briefly about this since she has been TAing at least during the pandemic. Interviewee becomes the interviewer.
I can quickly say something, yeah. Since I've just been TAing, not leading my own class, Rebecca has, so we can just have her jump back on. But so I've definitely noticed that, that students are burnt out just as professors and grads and everybody else has been. I think Zoom it's very difficult to keep people engaged. Zoom fatigue is very real. But one thing that I have noticed is that at least the professors that I've gotten to talk to, and when I've gotten to talk to other students, people who are still in coursework, it does sound like people are getting a little more understanding around things that maybe they hadn't been. So, not to like try and put a positive spin on things, but I do think that hopefully the kinds of empathy towards the mental health struggles that students face, the kind of pressure students face, a kind of openness when you're struggling. I'm hoping that these are things that like will hope will stick around in academia, and that professors will be a little more understanding and flexible, and that students will be a little more comfortable opening up when they are struggling.
Yeah, and I am about to teach a class this summer, and so we'll see sort of, it'll be online. So I don't have a lot to compare it to. Last time I taught was before the pandemic started. So I don't know what will sort of happen, but I find that I'm at a loss for language broadly. So I would be open to suggestions for, is there a word that means more than burnout? Like, that it feels like it's lost all meanings. Like, no, we're so far beyond the part where we're exhausted and we have no energy to do anything or excitement about anything. Sorry, Gina, I know you're trying to like pull positive things and I keep being like, everything is bad.
No, not at all. No need to apologize. And I think you're right. I think we also need to acknowledge that just because we've kind of in some kind of way gotten used to this doesn't mean it isn't terrible, and it is worthwhile to acknowledge that for sure. I have one more question, and then I'm gonna segue into, because not only are you teaching your own class this summer, you're also going to be teaching at a special event in June. But okay, before we get to that, Carl asks, have the LUC union folks connected with other union folks in the area, like Kenzo Shibata, a school teacher and organizer?
Ooh, we have not, but I'm going to write down the name. I can see the question as well. A few Loyola union folks walked the picket line with Chicago Teachers Union back in, I want to say it was like January of 2020 or maybe winter 2019 when they were on strike the last time. So there's been some sort of isolated sort of solidarity moves, but nothing super sustained. But that is a very good suggestion. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, any last minute questions I'm happy to take, but we are gonna start wrapping up because we've got about 4 minutes left. So I will, of course, thank you, Claire, for a very interesting talk. But before we do our closing things, I do want to take just like a quick minute to promote an upcoming event. So if all of you have been enjoying these LUC public philosophy talks, then especially for undergrads, I encourage you to check out our upcoming event that also hosted by LUC MAP, which is our Living Philosophy Virtual Retreat. So this is a free 2-day event. It'll be June 26th through 27th. I think Rebecca will hopefully stick a link to that in the chat. And we're going to talk about these kinds of things about how to apply philosophy to activism, organizing, and daily life. And Claire, you're going to be part of that too, right?
Yes.
Have you, not to put you on the spot, have you thought at all about what you might talk about?
Not really.
That's okay. You have time. But there are definitely going to be some really cool things. Rebecca's also going to be leading a workshop. So if you want to do that, yeah, check out the link. And okay, so with that, Claire, I'm going to give you the floor if you have any closing thoughts. Otherwise.
No, just thanks, everyone. I feel like we maybe didn't get to talk as much about anger. We talked about rage, I guess, but thanks for being here with me and tuning in.
Yes, thank you, Claire, for a great interview. A very interesting topic. I'm excited to see how your dissertation goes, and congratulations again on your fellowship. And just to let everybody know, this is going to be our last public philosophy talk for the spring semester. So there won't be any talks during the summer, but please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you'll get notifications about our next public philosophy talk for fall semester, so probably the first week of September. And all right, I guess that's basically it. Thanks again, Claire. Thanks again, everybody, for showing up. And see you in a few months. Oh, and you're getting some thank yous. Oh.
Hi, Mom.
All right, we'll sign off now. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night.
Thanks, Gina. Thanks, Rebecca. Bye.